This is the first and only chapter I have so far of a science fiction story that I'm still in the process of writing. The story is set thousands of years in the future and revolves around a man who rejects having a Neuralink implant like the rest of society, making him both a wanted man and an outcast. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy this first chapter. Everybody Gerald has ever known has concluded that he has lost his mind at some point. The truth, however, is that he's just a free spirit. And I don't say that in the sense of a metaphor. He truly is a free man in mind and soul. Of course, this was not all by choice. No, he presently lives on the fringes of society, a place he now considers home. Gerald didn't feel at home, though, because feeling at home involves love, affection, and some sense of purpose. Some sense of organic unity, or a common cause. Yes, he's been writing a book. Perhaps it's just a last-ditch effort as a coping mechanism for the loneliness. Books about history are all he's ever read, since the time he was a young boy. With a sense of profound fascination and a longing for the social precedents of old in which he engulfed himself in, he had gleefully plowed through these outdated texts. Now, though, looking into his cold, empty apartment, he was reminiscing, thinking about what he had once read. These prized possessions of sanctified knowledge sat there on his shelf, an archaic invention indeed, and that's not even considering the paper books that laid on top of it, as he let them collect dust. He didn't have the gall to pick them up again, for it made his heart ache. Longing for something unattainable doesn't exactly put a man at ease, after all. Sitting at his desk, alone in his one-bedroom apartment, he ruminated. "Let's put it this way," he mumbled to himself, looking out the cold, dead window in his 10th-floor apartment. There were snowflakes falling from the heavens, lightly dusting the dread-ridden city of silicone dreams. Do you ever have a dream and fall in love? He then looked down at his knees, pitifully dramatizing himself as if he were in an audition of sorts. An audition, that is, for acceptance of, well, himself. You find these feelings in the caverns of your consciousness, prying at you. Maybe it's your soulmate. You don't know. You don't know who this person in your dream even is. But at some point you wake up, yearning for this person, this construct. Flashbacks overcame him. The tribe. It elicited these feelings for him, feelings of acceptance and organic, genuine, heartfelt connectedness. His vision lazily refocused on his knees with little effort. That's how I felt, he realized, for what seemed like the first time. When I read, he sighed, when I read those history books. The door knocked, instantaneously knocking him out of his introspective daze. The mantises, he gasped. It doesn't make sense, he thought. At this point, I've been offline for years now. It didn't matter, though. It wasn't just that they were after him, it was that they were after him. And they almost always have been, ever since his first awakening. Charlie shuddered. Another knock. This time 3 heavy knocks in succession instead of the usual moderate 4. These 3 knocks were fiercer, yet patient nonetheless. They were lifeless, as always. This wasn't his first encounter with them, after all. But nonetheless, they remained their usual steady, disappointed, unrelenting knocks. They were lifeless, as always. This wasn't their first encounter with him, after all, but nonetheless remained their usual steady, disappointed, unrelenting knocks. He knew what they would do if he answered the door. They would act calm. They were always calm. That was the problem. They weren't subjected to natural human emotions. In fact, there was nothing human at all about these droning, menacing shells of a biological human body. Everything was a calculation. Every idiom, every blink, every subconscious mannerism. They only followed a purely logical sequence of commands made by a cold and calculated entity that guided their every motion. Despite this, they did everything in their power to make their actions seem natural and unscripted. "We just like to talk," they'd say, with uncanny smiles on their face and dead eyes in their skull. All of it meant to represent connection and hide its own utility. But Charlie had a unique gift. He thought briefly about it. As technology progresses, the masses conceal themselves deeper and deeper into the ultimate grave of their own technological impairment. They venture down the rabbit hole, further and further from their own natural form, further and further towards the sun, until they unknowingly accept their final destination as a degenerated shell of who they used to be. They behold a status of technological impairment amongst themselves that they come to openly accept as canon to their own identity. They lose sight of their own ancient, evolved abilities that took millions of years to develop, and to such an extent that when they take any stride in a more natural direction and regain any semblance of natural, previously dormant abilities, they feel as if they've acquired superpowers, all the while missing the fact that they didn't become better, they had just become less artificial. Charlie, on the other hand, had such a gift. His gift was that of being a human being in his natural form. Well socialized, albeit he spent much of his time in isolation, and sharply cognizant of unnatural human behaviors. Charlie glanced under the door. A foot at the forefront of the group was tapping. "They found me off the grid," he reluctantly, finally accepted. Charlie silently scurried around the room. The benefit of Charlie's predicament was that he had prepared for this. In fact, the abandoned city had gotten so lonely that he had secretly been hoping for visitors, even if they didn't have his best interests in mind. In the offline world, Charlie knew he didn't need much to survive. He took his wireless hydrogen charger, a well-designed product of the nuclear sort, surprisingly from the turn of the century. He silently pried his phone off his clumsy old desk. Ah, the Glenheimer P190. Archaic, isn't it? He thought. The truth, however, was that it was a great utility for occasional and necessary ventures into the online world. The sleek device was the last dying attempt for market success with external brain-machine interfaces before internal interfaces were written into governance as a, quote, fundamental basic human right. Whatever that was supposed to mean. The company optimistically included a wireless connection to the brain without the need for a chip of any sort. Of course, it used an awkward, roundabout way to do it, and its performance in doing so was still miles behind the other interface competition, but it appealed to the old-timers and the God-fearing critics who still opposed the newer technology's advancement, the final wave of opposition. The mantises had run out of patience. The door handle was now shaking violently. They didn't use verbal force, only calculation. Shouting to open up would rely on too heavy an understanding of emotion and manipulation. With a sliver of fear in his step, Charlie walked towards the window and looked down. The door was now the subject of coordinated, powerful hammering. The metal frame of the door, holding the deadbolt in its rein, was starting to bend at its stress points. There was no fire exit. Fires rarely broke out after the 22nd century and the upcoming phenomenon of artificial intelligence-powered security monitoring that saw its infancy in the 21st century. The banging stopped. Charlie froze. Maybe it was an intimidation tactic. Or worse, they had received intel from the Counsel. Charlie looked up at the door, horizontal to his cramped apartment room. He was ready to leave. The question was, when? Meanwhile, in the abandoned apartment's hallway, the shiny silver shoes, which reeked of artificial leather and dread, in a drove of 3 pairs, began a coordinated mecha towards the elevator. Charlie determinedly wrestled his trusty P190 out of his side pocket. He had planned for this moment for months, no, years. In preparation for his escape, Charlie cautiously peered out his opened window from the abandoned building, which still had much of the amenities and inventions from AI's golden age of innovation from the 22nd century, and spotted an all-net corporation delivery drone in the distance. Perfect, he half-whispered to himself, under his breath. He looked down to set up a local field interface on his smart device to connect his brain to the online world. Conveniently, before he could do that, the device's AI had predicted this motion and had already started on setting it up. Charlie knew it was a gamble. The things, they might have left at this point. After all, they didn't qualify as any type of sentient humans to Charlie. To be fair, though, in the society Charlie found himself in, nobody did. They would have a hard time finding him here after all. The city he lived in was extremely unpopular, near suicidal to live in, and that was for a reason. The online world was largely inaccessible in this city. Connection could only be obtained through archaic means, such as run-down and outmoded 6G cell phone towers that only remained in service for emergency use. Bandwidth on these towers was low enough to suffocate any chip user's buffet of usual connection, and this proved to be particularly unpleasant to any typically chipped person. Anyone, that is, but Charlie. He had found the best of both worlds, an empty place where he could occasionally peer into the online world from a distance, when necessary, with the only phone available to do so, and the only web grid towers that were outmoded enough to be difficult to backtrack by the Counsel. Charlie had taken on the calculated risk. They were most likely gone. The truth was that no matter how powerful and intelligent the mantises might seem while within the range of the grid, when they lost connection to their ultimate source of power, they slowly went mad from their withdrawal. Besides, Charlie had received intel not long ago that the residence he was currently at was just one possibility in a long list of suspected locations developed by the Counsel. He then looked down at his disheveled and worn-out pants. I can't stay here. The fact that they even knew about one of his locations, even if it was hiding somewhere deep within a lengthy, damning list, was unsettling. He had been nomadic for years anyways. This was just his life. As he waited for the archaic algorithm to finish loading its database, he once again gazed abroad. It was always dark in this place. Charlie hadn't seen the sun from the outside world for at least 2 months. Of course, the dome stayers had realized this long ago. Nearly every room, at least slightly above the most isolated class in the early 22nd century, was equipped with accurate circadian lights of the utmost quality, strategically designed to be indistinguishable from natural sunlight, working overtime when civilians turned their windows' transparency off. Though Charlie still felt dismay. There was something that was just too artificial about his sun lamps in his room. And the outside was worse, with no sky left to look at, because the entire sky was merely a thick concrete dome. In the past, it had simulation capabilities, projecting massive displays of sunlight, starlight, or moonlight from its corridors. But that archaic machinery had long since been out of commission. The dome-capped city was a massive mega-project, undertaken by the Council of Babel's International Interest Sector, right at the dawn of advanced multi-factor neural networks, which were specifically designed for futurology and threat reduction. One specific AI entity, which was deemed to be the crown jewel of the nation's international security, had warned the Council of a specifically horrific nuclear war that it had calculated to take place within the next 100 years with uncomfortably slim margins of error. Retrospectively, it was to the great nation's dismay that this sector never once stopped for a minute to consider whether the AI, Providence, deserved the credibility it had been assumed. The Council never once considered that the project may be an enormous waste of resources, that the war might never happen in the first place, or perhaps that citizens needed real sunlight. In the end, the war never came, and thus there was a mass exodus out of the monolith. Charlie took in the abandoned nuclear city, a once thriving population in the tense times that followed the new beginnings of the 22nd century. Cold, decrepit air, much like the mantises that he knew were presently lurching through it. It smelled stale, like an old cave. The materials used were over 100 years old after all, and most of the buildings remained unfinished. And in the distance, shrouded by fog and a strange sense of nostalgia, were the red blinking lights of late 21st century cell phone towers. Even his phone, in all its age, couldn't connect to such systems. Eerily, though, they persisted relentlessly, blinking once on, once off, like they had been for centuries, intermittently washing the vacant buildings with an ever so unsettling glow. As for the buildings, though, nothing had changed. Lonely, alien, they sat on their foundation, occasionally with a window that would glow from the lights being left on by a civilian before the exodus, and still hasn't stopped glowing since. The city, which was still largely unfinished, was a haunting, cold blend of cutting-edge technology and constructional idiocracy. It was unified by a generation that was captivated by the newfound bread-and-circus-like distractions of the online world. A new era of Rome. The city was strange in look and feel, designed with the input of the last generation of climate change activists recorded into history, who had vouched to eradicate conventional means of streets and parkways in favor of multiple-story buildings that met parks consisting of golf course-type grass at their foundations, which prevailed throughout the entire area of the city. Of course, these activists became unnecessary with the introduction of affordable nuclear fusion energy, which made energy dirt cheap and frankly underappreciated. After all, it was the reason that the city still had energy and that some of the windows still had light. If it weren't for the online world, Charlie supposed, there would be many people still living here. That, however, was a bygone era. Yet again, Charlie picked up his reliable P-190. It was time to get out of the old place. He certainly wouldn't miss it. It was only a temporary home. Charlie had planned this many times, as logical people do. Charlie was glad to be a logical person in his time, as most people that he saw around him spent their entire life being entertained by whimsical distractions and indulgent fantasies. People was somewhat of an illogical word for this group, he thought, because sometimes Charlie felt like he was the only real person. Promptly, he ran a program he had developed on his phone to fetch a delivery drone from outside the city. His program was necessarily complicated. He needed a big drone to carry him, not one of those smaller ones that seemed to be making a comeback in popularity. He watched his phone as the screen ran a series of prompts up a terminal, and the progress percentage demonstrated to him approximately how close the drone was to being compromised. From the drone's perspective, it was just doing another delivery. Charlie had conveniently posed himself as Boxcore, the company that used drones as its primary labor force. Little did this drone know, however, that it would not be going to Boxcore. Thank you guys for listening to Chapter 1. I'm currently working on Chapter 2, and it will be released soon on my channel. So don't forget to hit that subscribe so you don't miss out on the next chapter.